All right, everybody, welcome back to GSN, my division post-draft review and predictions. Today, I'm going to be going over the NFC East. This, of course, the division involving the Eagles, Cowboys, Giants, and Redskins, one of the weaker divisions in the NFL this past year, with, of course, the Eagles making the playoffs. Giants and the Redskins both with very high picks, and the Cowboys just kind of being there. Always felt a little bit like they were this close to making a push, but could never quite do it. So to start off with the NFC East, I have made my predictions for this division. Personally, I think the Eagles will make the playoffs, win the division. I think the Eagles are the best team in this division. I think they'll go 11-6, and not have a first round bye, but clinch their division. I think the Cowboys will go 9-8, but miss the playoffs on tiebreakers. I think the Giants will go 8-9, and I think the Redskins will go 4-13. Just some notes about why the predictions are the way they are here. So I'll start with the Eagles here. I think the Eagles are the best team in the NFC East. That being said, their offseason hasn't gone without a few issues, or at least in the eyes of the fan base. Philadelphia had some what many consider questionable draft choices. Notably being Jalen Hurts being picked in the second round. A lot of people saw this as a dig at Carson Wentz, who is their quarterback. People were saying that Carson Wentz should request a trade. Stuff like that. Also, bigger positions of need, obviously, in Philadelphia, so people were confused why they would take a quarterback in the second round. Personally, I don't mind the pick too much. I know I do think that Carson Wentz is a great quarterback. I think he's definitely a top 10 quarterback in the NFL. He is very fragile, and this has proven that over the past few years. So investing in a solid backup is a fine choice, in my opinion. That being said, obviously, if you're counting on winning the NFL, winning the Super Bowl, you would have to kind of count on your starting quarterback not getting hurt. However, the Eagles kind of broke this theory a couple years back when they won the Super Bowl with Nick Foles under center. So yeah, I'm personally okay with investing in a backup. They, in the first round, drafted Jalen Reagor, who is a solid receiver. I mean, he's a pretty good receiver. Definitely is going to be a talented NFL wide receiver. However, I did feel like there were a few better choices available if they wanted a wide receiver in the first round. Of course, I am not an NFL GM, so I don't know about this, but I saw a lot more upside in Justin Jefferson, who was taken right after Reagor was. But also I would have looked at second round wide receivers, including Pittman and KJ Hamler. Those are just two people that I looked at and I saw like incredible amounts of upside, and they were people I wanted teams to see the bright side in. And I mean, Hamler got taken in the second round, which was pretty much better than what he was projected, but I thought Hamler was a much better receiver. I thought he looked like me every bit of first round talent. But Reagor still does have a lot of upside, and I think he'll be a NFL caliber wide receiver. Otherwise, outside of Reagor and Hurts, there wasn't much notable talent taken by Philly, I felt like. Obviously, it's too early to tell who will succeed in the NFL and who won't, but there wasn't any late round, mid-round players that I really looked at and was like, that's kind of a really good pick for a late round. I didn't see that with Philadelphia. One of their biggest acquisitions in free agency, or rather through a trade, was the acquisition of Darius Slay from Detroit, who they picked up to help bolster the secondary. And Darius Slay is a very solid, quite underrated in his time in Detroit, defensive back, and is definitely a CB1. But He is slowly in decline. You can tell kind of over his last year and a half with Detroit. He's had a couple of games where you're just like, oh man, I thought he was a little bit better than that. Um, and he was also given a massive payday, which means a large amount of the cap is going into just one cornerback. So that's kind of rough for Philadelphia, but they were really desperate. He's definitely still a baller though. I just don't believe he'll play like a top 5 cornerback, which is what Philadelphia paid him to be. Um, Philadelphia heavily invested in their backfield outside of Slay. They had a Jalen Mills, Rodney McLeod, and Nickel Roby Coleman on top of, of course, Slay. So they were heavily interested in buffing up that secondary that was getting burned in every single game last year. Philadelphia is still really good in the trenches. Their offensive line is probably the best in the league. And the D line is pretty good as well. It's not as good as the offensive line, but it's still a really solid unit, probably a top 10 unit. Their roster hasn't improved terribly from last year, but I do think it'll be enough to make the playoffs and win the East. Again, improving the secondary is huge. If their secondary is twice as good as it was last year, if it's just it should be on paper. But if it's just a little bit improved from last year, this team will definitely improve. But outside of the secondary, not much improvement was made. On to the Dallas Cowboys. The Dallas Cowboys had a pretty good draft overall. CeeDee Lamb in the first round and Trayvon Diggs in the second both have really good potential, really good star potential. I felt like those are 2 picks that most people watching would have been stoked to get. And this is another team like the Eagles that when I was looking, I didn't see really much late round talent, any names that stuck out to me, but I could be proven wrong. Like I said with the Eagles, I could be proven wrong. The roster has a few all-stars on it when I was looking up and down the roster, and a bunch of average Joes also. So there's a seriously deep divide between they have Ezekiel Elliott and Amari Cooper, and then they have DeMarcus Lawrence on defense. But and on top of that, a couple of good offensive line pieces. But I worry about positional depth for this team because you look at the roster and outside of Amari Cooper, and now they have CeeDee Lamb and all that, and it's well, who's their quarterback? Oh, it's Dak Prescott. He's okay. People think he's a little bit better than okay. I mean, he's not gonna lose you a game, but he probably won't win you a game in my opinion. But outside of that, they have a weaker secondary. I looking up and down their secondary, and it wasn't anybody super, they have this lockdown corner. They have Clinton Dix, and I know they have Chidobe Awuzie, but their secondary isn't super exciting, and good quarterbacks with good wide receivers will burn this team on defense for sure. And outside of DeMarcus Lawrence, their defensive line again is okay. Nothing to scream home about on Dallas's defense. This is probably going to be a defense that ranks around the early 20s in the league, I would say. Definitely will come to bite them in certain games, but against lesser opponents, they probably won't see much trouble. This team probably will live and die by its offense. So if this team wants to overperform my expectations, the offense will really need to step it up. Dak Prescott will need to have a stellar year for his team to make a run, I felt like. And I personally don't really believe in Dak Prescott. I felt like he always felt a little bit worse than what the media generally portrayed him as being. So people always say that Dak Prescott is really good. Is Dak Prescott an elite talent in the league? And I don't think he is. I think he's pretty mid-table in terms of quarterbacks. I always felt watching him that there was nothing super special about him. He can make pretty much most of the throws that other quarterbacks can make, but he's not spectacular at it. And he also has a tendency to make mistakes in big games. However, Andy Dalton was recently signed to the Cowboys as a backup, and he's a good backup. That's basically what you want in a backup, is a veteran talent that you can like depend on and say, all right, well, if our quarterback goes down, this guy can win us a game or two, kind of like what Nick Foles was in Philadelphia. And if Dak has a couple of bad games, we could see a Dalton-led Cowboys team, even though like everybody in the Cowboys organization is going to tell you, no, Dak Prescott's our quarterback. If Dak Prescott has a couple of atrocious games where like he just doesn't play up to the standard that they've held him to, expect Andy Dalton to come in and try to give this team a spark, because that's kind of the thing you can afford to do when you have two good-ish named quarterbacks. However, over the years, the Cowboys have done little to inspire confidence in them, and they always feel like they underperform expectations. So that said, I'm going to say this year it'll probably be no different, which is why I'm picking them to go 9-8, which, you know, is average. But I think this team will just barely miss the playoffs. Once again, underperform expectations after every power ranking in the league has them in like the top 7 to start the year, and they'll win their first game, and then they'll be at like top 5. I just don't think they'll make the playoffs. Not with this roster. On to the New York Giants. The Giants chose to bolster their offensive line with the 4th overall pick in the draft, taking what many consider to be the best offensive lineman in the draft with Andrew Thomas out of Georgia. Also got a first-round talent in the early second round with Xavier McKinney out of Alabama. And looking at later-round talent, I really liked Carter Coughlin out of Minnesota. He was a big part of Minnesota's stellar, like, out-of-nowhere year in the Big Ten this year. So going with the offensive lineman of the first round, obviously to help out Daniel Jones in the pocket, and a team, I feel like the Giants have one of the better chances of turning it around. They feel like they're a team that's better than their record showed last year. I feel like this team can turn it around as long as they stay short on injuries. They had a surprisingly solid offense for a team that picked 4th in the draft. If Daniel Jones shows more improvement, this could be a very good offense, I felt like. Barkley is unquestionably one of the best running backs in the league, and then you have solid wide receivers like Sterling Shepard, Golden Tate, Darius Slayton, who proved himself late in the season last year, and then a good tight end in Evan Ingram. However, the defense does have a lot of question marks. They picked up James Bradbury in free agency, but outside of him, secondary doesn't look super great. The defensive line is all right, but isn't super deep. Overall, this team basically just looks like an ever so slightly worse version of the Cowboys. I feel like the Cowboys' skill position players are ever so slightly better than the Giants' skill position players, and I feel like the Cowboys' defense is ever so slightly better than the Giants' defense, and I feel like they have the same problems, and they're very close teams. But just imagine, like, you know, if the Cowboys are like the name brand version of being average, the Giants are the great value brand of being average. That's what it feels like this team is going to be like. So beyond that, I think they'll go 8-9. You know, average, ever so slightly below average. They might be in the playoff hunt until like the last 3 weeks, probably. On to the last team in the NFC East. We get to talk about the Washington Redskins, who picked 2nd overall and got defensive stud, what many consider to be a future Hall of Famer. Absolutely the highest praise you can get for a draft pick in Chase Young. He was an instant impact player, and you could ask up and down the draft, if you didn't want a quarterback, that's the guy you wanted with your draft pick. So the Redskins basically got the best player in the draft, which is what he was considered by many. Outside of Chase Young, though, not like the most stellar draft. One pick that I did like in their draft was the Antonio Gandy Golden pick, the wide receiver out of Liberty. He put up crazy numbers at Liberty, and even if it was against much lesser opposition, but it's exactly the type of thing you want to look for in a mid-round wide receiver, is a guy that dominated lesser competition, because you never know. You know, obviously he dominated, so he can play up to the level of the league, but, you know, exactly what you look for in mid-level, late round talent. However, when looking at the rest of their roster, it's pretty underwhelming. There's some decent pieces in there. Like they have Montez Sweat on the defensive line. Kendall Fuller and Landon Collins are also on that defense, which are some, pretty good players. Not like I wouldn't call any of those guys elite. But they are pretty solid players that are definitely like up top half starters in the NFL. And then also breakout wide receiver Terry McLaurin, who absolutely balled out for the Redskins last year, was just an absolute diamond in the rough for them. Went crazy. He's a really bright star. But they also have some pretty bad holes in important positions. They do have a pretty underwhelming offensive line after the Trent Williams trade. And overall, they just don't have many players that'll like put people in seats, if there's even going to be seats to put people in this year. Other than, I would say, Terry McLaurin. Like, Terry McLaurin right now is the bright star of the Washington Redskins. Outside of him, I don't see much to look forward to for this team. They still do have Darius Geis and Adrian Peterson, so if they both stay healthy, the Redskins could have a run game to rely on, which I think they'll probably need, because honestly, in my opinion, Dwayne Haskins is a pretty suspect quarterback prospect. I don't see him as a lasting quarterback in this league. I just don't trust him. I don't believe in Dwayne Haskins personally. If he ends up having a pretty good year, the Redskins probably won't be half bad, because then they can have Haskins to McLaurin and a solid running game with veteran Adrian Peterson and Darius Geis, assuming he doesn't get hurt, because that dude has been a walking hospital. But Haskins just has done little to impress me, even though it was only his rookie year last year, and a lot of people are predicting him to make a leap in his second year. I just don't, when I watch him play, I'm not like, this guy could be good. I just look at a guy who just has a very low ceiling, in my opinion. And honestly, at the end of this year, if he still doesn't perform, I would not be shocked if Washington in free agency after the end of the season picks up a quarterback replacement or drafts one. Kind of pulls a little bit later Josh Rosen, like what Arizona did. I hope he succeeds genuinely, because he's he seems like a really nice guy, but I don't have belief in Dwayne Haskins at the moment. So with that said, that will be the end of my episode predicting the NFC East. Next episode, I will be covering the NFC South, and I will go over that very interesting division now, with all of the moves made in that division, and that will probably be one of the more interesting episodes of this series. So with that said, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.